We are very happy to see you. As you may know by now, today is the first day of the online launch of the Routledge Handbook of Architecture, Urban Space and Politics. It's lovely to see you in such large numbers, particularly at the audience front, and from such globally diverse contexts. We've got an audience and panel members from Australia, New Zealand, UK, of course, and EU as well. Today, as I said, is the first day of what some of our colleagues have termed as the most epic book launch ever. So we would like to take that as a compliment. There are 3 more days to come after that today, and we're hoping that as each day progresses, it will be a more lively and a very discursive discussion, because that's what we are here for, not just to introduce the agenda of the handbook, but also to support very kind of collaborative and discursive conversation. In terms of the overview of how today will run, Farzaneh, the other editor of this Routledge Handbook, and also my what seems to be my research partner in crime, and I will give a context to this project in the next 10 to 15 minutes. And then pass it on to Professor Stephen Walker and Associate Professor Dagmar Reinhardt, who each wrote a conclusion to the handbook. Stephen wrote it for Volume 1 and Dagmar to Volume 2. We will acknowledge them properly towards the end of this short introduction, but I think Dagmar and Stephen can't be acknowledged enough, not just for their willingness to write a conclusion, but also for their absolute commitment when it comes to this online launch, and for all of their wonderful ideas, and for pushing us ever more so with each meeting. So thank you so much, Stephen and Dagmar. So in terms of this project, just a bit of an overview of how the agenda of the project arose. Both Farzaneh and I kind of realized that there's a bit of a lack of a coherent sources unpack the critical relationship between architecture, urban space, politics, and socioeconomic context through multidisciplinary lenses. And even though there are a number of critical handbooks that have been written on the relationship between architecture and the urban, and all of which are superb and commendable in their own right, we identified further gaps in scholarship, given that a lot of architectural and urban theory does a number of things. It either treats space as neutral or passive rather than politically active. Also, the scholarship often is disengaged from urgent contemporary 21st century realities. And when some engagement is done, it tends to be done either purely from a theoretical lens or more from a technocratic lens. So there isn't a cross-pollination between these two areas. Also, the focus tends to be narrowly on the Western or the Anglophone contexts, and it tends to miss the so-called Global South experiences. And when the Global South experiences are addressed, they don't tend to talk with the Western and Anglophone contexts. Also, the scholarship tends to rely on single theoretical lenses, especially critiques of neoliberalism, that and often ignore other oppressive forces such as race, colonialism, and so on. And also, the discourse tends to be fragmented and often lacks a diverse global and interdisciplinary approach that also brings a sense of urgency irrespective of the current political spatial crisis. So what this project done, and what Farzaneh and I have attempted to do with a great team of collaborators, is that this project seeks to address the identified gaps with the desire to reposition architects and urbanists within broader planetary, ecological, and human rights contexts in a way that recognizes contemporary challenges connected to climate change, global inequities, surveillance capitalism, militarized borders, racial injustices, and to start to think about all of these issues, not just as political or economic challenges, but also spatial ones. So, motivated by an interest in situated knowledge, we wanted to explore diverse case studies where scholars and practitioners start to examine how space enables, restricts, or transforms possibilities across different contexts, regions, and histories. And this was done by bringing together a two-volume handbook, which through a comprehensive and interdisciplinary lenses and diverse global voices starts to critically analyze the contemporary spatial landscape under a number of different themes or questions. Also, we must kind of say that the handbook is not claiming to be all-inclusive handbook, whether it's from topics or geographical contexts. So, across the two volumes and 68 chapters, the Routledge Handbook of Architecture, Urban Space and Politics is endeavoring to provide cutting-edge contemporary debates in addition to a study of actual projects from around the world that address spatial politics. And in doing so, we are very glad to say that this is the first two-volume handbook in architecture, planning, landscape and urban design published by Routledge. In terms of volume specific, volume one, the subtitle of which is Violence, Spectacle and Data, was published in November 2022. And it interrogates how architecture and urbanism are complicit in oppression. This was addressed in terms of 5 thematics, the first one being violence and war machines, the second one, security and borders, the third one, race, identity and ideology, the fourth one, spectacle and the screen, and the fifth one was called mapping landscapes and big data. Volume 2, the subtitle of which is Ecologies, Social Participation and Marginalities, was published 2 years later, exactly in November 2024, so 2 years after the first volume, and it focused on how architecture and urban space can unsettle the unquestioned construct of the spatial politics of governing. This was kind of addressed across 5 thematics. The first one, events and dissidence. The second one, biopolitics, ethics and desire. The third one, climate and ecology. The fourth one, urban commons and social participation. And the fifth one, marginalities and postcolonialism. So ultimately, the handbooks question the extent to which architecture and urban space can become spatial tools to address the contemporary challenges, but also reimagine the way that we think about or act in terms of questions around democracy, justice, difference, ecological concerns, and so on. And our thinking across the handbooks is that we can't maintain the approaches of thinking and designing that were operative in the last century in order to address the pressing challenges of the 21st century. So on this note, I'll pass it on to Farzaneh, who will talk about the methodology and the background narrative behind this project.
All right, thanks, Nikolina. And hi, everyone. Special thanks to the attendees. Just a quick introduction. I'm Farzaneh Haghighi, and I'm based at the University of Auckland and the co-editor of this handbook. Okay, so Nikolina and I came together first through completion of our PhD at the University of Auckland that was supported by the same supervisors. While our topics, contexts, and methodologies were different from each other, we shared a similar interest in the relationship between architecture, urban, and the politics. The origin of this project particularly goes back to mid-2018, when we came together to organize a conference with the title called Political Matters, Spatial Thinking of the Alternative at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. This interdisciplinary conference took place in July 2019. As part of this conference, we had to facilitate, and we are facilitating workshops and discussions with the presenters and the audience. Following the conference, we were invited to edit an issue of a journal called Intersect, Journal of Architecture and Related Arts, that is published collaboratively by Auckland University of Technology, AUT, and University of Auckland, both in New Zealand. We were invited to co-edit an issue on the same theme called Political Matters that was published in December 2020, which is an open access online peer-reviewed journal you can find easily online. So the idea of the handbook emerged from this process, from the conference and from the edited journal, that we realized there is a significant gap and untapped potential at the intersection of architecture, urban, and politics. And this process helped us to create a framework for the themes, to find collaborators for these projects and the reviewers. We continue this conversation with various global scholars and practitioners, whether in person or via Zoom, to help shape the focus of these handbooks. Putting together the proposal for this project took around 6 months and another few to identify the right publisher and the right book series for it. Upon receiving 3 review reports from Routledge that we submitted our book proposal to, we engaged with further revisions, and Routledge consequently invited us to expand this project into 2 books because the themes expanded, which went beyond, and unpacking them went beyond being able to include in just 1 volume. We signed the book contract in June 2020, and to be honest, we didn't expect it to take us 5 years now where we are. Over the past few years, 5 years, we faced also very unexpected surge of global events, including COVID, fast development of AI, Ukraine-Russia war, and Gaza genocide. Following the recommendation of the reviewers as well, we contacted contributors individually, one by one, to make sure their research is aligned with the proposed thematics of this project. Each chapter went through 2 or at times 3 blind review process, and later on subsequent revisions were prompted by Nikolina and I to make sure the chapter are responding to the project agendas too. Some of our contributors identified us as Stanley Kubrick's of editing, which you would like to take as a compliment during this process. So after all, the process was underscored by the agenda to ensure quality control, and it wouldn't have been possible without the patience, understanding, and engagement of all the contributors and generous support of all peer reviewers. So a few words about the key aspects that form the structure and methodology of this work. So our focus, as Nikolina mentioned, from the start was on contemporary world challenges as they connect to space. So we wanted to map the trajectories, properties of the contemporary world in its relation to space. Some of the key ideas informing the structure of the books are as follows: to explore the contemporary debates, explore the actual projects and theories that address spatial politics, examining projects both across global North and global South, and having cross-disciplinary perspective across architecture, urbanism, planning, art, sociology, anthropology, international relations, fashion, philosophy, computation, media, to visual arts and practice-based perspectives. The project aimed to expand the geographical reach over cross-cultural contexts to include projects and examples from US, UK, Ireland, Europe, South America, Africa, Middle East, Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. We aim to incorporate a wide range of methods that can be applied to diverse range of geographies, and having both emerging and established scholars within our contributors. And we made also a conscious effort to balance gender representation across the two volumes. So in short, this project first makes it visible how spatial practices are formed and inform economic, political, and structural violence, and then to open a hopeful door to address them so that spatial practices can operate beyond the corporatized and bureaucratized orders of power, techno-managerial, and consumer-oriented capitalist economic models. So with that, I hand it over to Nikolina.
Okay, thank you so much, Farzaneh. And you just kindly reminded me. I was so keen to start with the online launch that I forgot to mention my name, Nikolina Bobic, and that I'm coming from Plymouth University in the UK. But I think I was just so ready to launch into the debate and discussion that slipped my memory. So thank you, Farzaneh. In terms of the collaboration, apart from the two handbooks being of interest to scholarly and a practice-based audience, the distinctive aspect of the handbooks is that each thematic is foregrounded with an introduction chapter on the theme. And the thematic introduction was endeavored to be written in a textbook style so that it becomes accessible to an undergraduate audience, in order to be able to grapple with and understand these very complex issues. For example, the theme of violence and war machines, which is the first thematic of the volume 1, is foregrounded with an introduction to the topic, which on one hand generally maps the key issues of violence and war machines across the 20th and more importantly, the 21st century. But also, secondly, specifically links some of these issues to the chapters which feature in that thematic section. So the ordering is usually that each thematic section is composed of one introduction to the topic, and then it's followed by another 5 to 6 chapters connected to that theme or topic. So while the introduction writers for each thematic did not work directly with all chapter authors, they engaged closely with the content of these chapters as they were being developed, using them to shape the introductory framing to the theme. So collaboration occurred not only at the larger handbook level, but also specifically within individual chapters, bringing together multiple authors to craft their contributions. The importance and urgency of collaboration is acknowledged by REF, the Research Excellence Framework in the UK, that seems to have a focus on collaborative impact projects and collaborative interdisciplinary teams. Its equivalent in New Zealand's performance-based research fund also highlights the importance of disseminating and applying knowledge beyond an academic audience. So we are committed to engaging with the public, not only with this launch, but also through the dissemination of knowledge that has arisen through this project via social media at this stage. And we will share with you all the different social media channels should you wish to follow them. So the importance of supporting collaborative projects was beautifully summed up by one of our contributors when we informed him that everything has been submitted and that the handbook is about to be published. And what he was saying is that he is glad to see that edited books are still finding publishers and that scholars are still coming together to create them, especially for a project that has taken 5 years to complete. So for our colleague and contributor, these projects are crucial because they establish communities, they help mentor early career researchers, and they also enable more flexible publishing formats and media. And most importantly, they help build networks, as we can see with today's launch, where we have such a fantastic group of panelists and audiences from across the world. What our colleague and contributor also felt that it is time for universities and governments to acknowledge the significance of collaborative projects. And we wholeheartedly support his thinking and the overall appeal of urgency when it comes to collaborative research projects. And now over to you, Farzaneh.
Thanks, Nikolina. So the few last words is about our acknowledgement and thanking a large group of people who came on board. So first of all, this project couldn't have been possible without the amazing support of Professor Stephen Walker and Associate Professor Dagmar Reinhardt, who not only engaged in mammoth task of writing the conclusion to the volume 1 and volume 2, but also for the generosity with their time and their support in the launch of this book across 4 days, as you're aware of. So special thanks to all the contributors across volume 1 and 2 for their passion, drive, and critical engagement with the subject matter, which took this project to new heights. Thank you for the patience, commitment, and good spirits with peer reviews and every marked up draft sent back your way. We really appreciate it. It would take too long for us to name the list, the name of the contributors. Just we have some numbers to share with you. To generate 32 chapters in volume 1, which totals 630 pages, 41 amazing scholars and practitioners were involved in volume 1. To produce 36 chapters in volume 2, which totals 726 pages, 64 remarkable scholars and practitioners were involved in the second volume. To get a better insight of the contributors' subject and chapters, Nikolina is going to copy the links to the books that you can find online, and you can click and have a look at all of the chapters. Special thanks to our peer reviewers who generously and voluntarily reviewed each chapter without any compensation. Their work were essential to the creation of this project and to upholding high standards to which we aspired. With over 140 individuals involved, their names are too long to include in this book launch, but we want to send a special thanks to them. Thanks to our endorsees, we were very lucky to attain acclaim for 2 volumes by globally recognized scholars. Thank you for seeing the value in this project. Their insights can be also found in the links that will be shared in the chat. We are also delighted to notice that our first handbook made it to the favorite academic books of Professor Stuart Eldon, which he noted in his weblog, Progressive Geographies. Again, the links can be found in the chat. Lastly, we want to thank the University of Auckland Research Fund, the Dissemination Research Fund, that allowed us and supported us to make the 2 co-edited chapters that Nikolina and I wrote to make them open access online. And also that fund allowed us to run this book launch and the social media campaign behind it. With that, we especially want to thank Ivana Chan, the University of Auckland Architecture graduates, the creative force behind this campaign, and the designer of so many posters and banners that you can see, including our background today in the Zoom. So thanks, Ivana. We also want to thank the University of Plymouth and University of Auckland for various research resources that they have provided us to carry through this project. Beyond the hardback of this book, there's an opportunity to purchase the ebook and the paperback version of this book. If you're affiliated with the university, we warmly encourage you to support the request of this handbook through your library channels. And beyond this, as Nikolina mentioned, we are committed to make this information available and accessible to the public through the social media campaign that we have started. The link, you can also watch bite-sized videos of some of the chapters, that the link to our YouTube channel can be found in the chat. For the rest of this session, I'm going to hand it over to Stephen and Dagmar, who will kindly share with you the key issues across the two volumes. And following that, we would have half an hour Q&A with with the collaborators. And everyone is welcome from our attendees. If you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A and we will address them and engage with them through the discussion. So without further ado, I want to pass it to Stephen and Dagmar.
Okay, I think I'll go first. We're going to take this volume by volume, a very quick reflection, I think. So I wrote the conclusion or the sort of conclusion halfway through for volume one. I'm Stephen Walker from at the University of Manchester in the UK. I think just to change the tone of the conversation rather than thanking everyone, I think it's a moment to acknowledge the enormous work that Farzaneh and Nikolina have done to kind of emphasize that this is a sort of celebratory event, these 4 days that we're doing. And for all the authors who've contributed chapters. I mean, this is a colossal undertaking. Nikolina was just giving you a list of some of the data that helps. I mean, I don't know if you know or have seen the handbook yet, but it's a colossal undertaking. 2 volumes, both running to nearly 700 pages, over 30 chapters. It's a phenomenal undertaking, and I think we really want to celebrate all of the work that you've done. When you were surprised that it had taken you 5 years to complete it, I was surprised that it's taken you only 5 years, because I think the scale and the ambition of the project has been absolutely phenomenal. And watching you from the sidelines at a safe distance, I think it's absolutely amazing what you've done. So I think really on behalf of all of us, massive congratulations. I think I'm going to sort of speed through to some of the conversation. So rather than repeating your summaries of volume one and volume two, I think my reflection on volume one, and Dagmar will say a few words about volume two, is the sheer breadth of topics. I mean, you listed some of them. The kind of complexity of architecture's involvement with violence, war, borders, security, race, identity politics, ideology, spectacle, data or big data, mapping, representation. These are huge areas. Geographically, again, you mentioned the sort of spread of countries that have been involved in or subject of the chapters, and I think this kind of the breadth of discussion has been really healthy. So to slow down again, maybe to encourage people in the audience that haven't seen or used the handbook, I think it's a really successful amazing piece of work that allows us to understand more about the complexities or architecture's involvement with societies and cities in particular. And it raises or articulates questions of structural interconnections at various different levels. I've also been thinking about it in terms of a handbook. What is it to prepare a handbook, or as users, how do we make use of handbooks? And I think the organisation of both volumes is really clear, but there are many different interconnections that can be played out and within one volume or across 2 volumes. So it might be that people are just jumping in to look at one particular section or one chapter, but I think the resonances that are set up within the volume are really incredible. So Faz and I were just chatting before we came on air. There's a real ambition for all of the essays to address very specific locations and situations. There's an urgency about this whole work, and it's really interesting, even 3 or 4 years down the line, to revisit some of these chapters and feel how the discussion there has changed or has been changed by world events in this short period of time. So in a second, we'll come to the panelists, the contributors, and begin to ask them to reflect a bit about those kinds of questions. But before we do that, I just want to pass over to Dagmar, who was involved with Volume 2, to kind of wrap it up, bring us to the end.
Yeah, hopefully. Thanks, Steve. Thank you very much. My name is Dagmar Reinhardt. I'm an associate professor at the University of Sydney, and I'm zooming in here from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We know Australia has been a colony for a very long time, and is in the process of acknowledging the rights and the authorship of the people who've been living here for a very long time. Before I do my reflection, and it's again a sort of gigantic task, because the handbook is not only fat and a brick, but it's also very rich in terms of nourishment and content. Big thanks to Nikolina and Farzaneh of bringing people together, and more importantly, much more than bringing these contributions together, really establishing a dialogue and giving people a platform and an opportunity from which they can develop their own ideas further, but which they also can use in terms of rubbing against, which is exactly what I've been doing. So part of my the many hats that I'm wearing is I'm both a researcher and architect. I'm an educator and academic, and so I have been coming to the second part of the volume 2 of the Handbook of Architecture, Urban Space, and Politics as someone who looks at how can I actually use that? What can I do with that? How can I brainstorm with this? Part of also what we're doing or what we're seeing today is architecture that's become extremely specialized and that has become extremely digitized. A trajectory that I have followed through, sort of bringing to education 3D modeling and scripting, and then all other processes towards fabrication, and working now and looking at all of this from the idea of robots and cyber physical systems, because we know that our cities are not are becoming data machines, really. Our smart city systems are populated with autonomous cars and drones. And we are increasingly sort of moving over to androids and cyber physical systems, so robots as machines that are in there. Why am I saying that? Because more than ever, we need a handle on politics, and particularly spatial politics, because as architects and as urban designers, that's effectively what we take care of. So really, for me, what the handbook does in both volumes is it asks these questions as to, are you political? And then if you are political, how political are you? And actually through which means. I see the handbook as an offering of a firework of ideas into which architecture can think and urban practice, and out of which architecture and urban practices can think. So these centers of attentions and attractions, they're actually offered through these five chapters or 5 sections, which the second volume is offering, which are also radically intersected and overlapping at many times. So some of the keywords that have been coming up for me are with events and dissidence. How do we actually do confirmations of squatting, of creative placemaking and identity? How do we create and co-create digital narratives? How can we implement DEY and self-organized occupations, and how can we have informal settlements? So these are all springboards and departure points that may arise and may inform and may nourish your ideas as they come through. In the second section of biopolitics, it's really working against inequalities, against the control of local populations, of situated social and ethical norms, and against socio-spatial polarizations, but really looking at desires and negotiations that citizens have across all their individual aspects. It offers elements of urban commons and social participation through the self-organizations by adopting communal items such as skate parks, expanding territories and reclaiming urban ground, of having people have a people plan, so a self-organization through community-led solutions, and really looking at practices of citizen participation. There's, of course, one of the sections deals with climate and ecologies, which has really surprising elements and entities of how politics and governance and human settlements are driven by properties, driven by socio-political networks, driven by geographical data and local contexts, and need to be seen within the context of globalization and these overspanning, very fluid networks that continue to develop. And lastly, but not least, there's a whole section on marginalities and post-colonialism, which is also extremely important because we are looking at how we can give voices, how we can evade state control, how we can establish cultures of resistance, how we can give voice to indigenous practices, and how we can change social structures, both for the governmental bodies, for the other bodies across sex, gender, and race, against reductionist views of bodies, incorporating our very diverse and very different psychological personalities. So this is, I'm really sorry, it's been a bit of a list, but these are all some of the anchor points that I find extremely interesting for architectural practice. And I think if people are, this is a bit of a call that please go and get this book, because a handbook is not meant to be read from front to back, but it's really meant to sit on the table and to look through and look for the keywords and then continue to unfold these narratives. And that's exactly what the handbook does across these two volumes. So yeah, a great thing to have. All the very beautiful panelists that we do have here. Shall we just go around and would you like to introduce yourselves and your name and institution, and then we're going to move into in a second series we're going to move into the questions maybe to get the discourse going. Katerina, do you want to start? Sorry.
Right, yeah. Hello everyone. I'm Katerina Antonopoulou. I'm a lecturer in architectural design at the University of Liverpool.
Yes, hello. My name is Sabine Knierbein, and I'm an associate professor for urban culture and public space at the Faculty of Architecture and Planning at TU Vienna in Austria.
Hi everyone, I'm Lutfuna Halata. I'm a senior lecturer in sociology and social policy at the University of Melbourne.
Hello everybody, my name is Francesco Prozzo. I'm a architectural theorist, a visual culturist and critical theorist at the University of Oxford Brookes and the School of Architecture.
Thanks everyone. And to pull you into a bit of discussion, Farzaneh and Nikolina sent round some very small questions to get a conversation going. So the first one was, can you tell us about the relationship between architecture, urbanism, and violence? And I was thinking, how can you interpret that either in the context of the particular chapters that you developed, or in the context of your practice, your situation more broadly? So I don't know if anyone has been mulling this over for the last few days, or has some kind of response to that question. It's early in the morning or late at night for most of us, so it might be quite a challenge to jump in with. But Katerina, you look like you're sort of primed for action. I mean, you put you on the spot.
I don't know. Well, yeah, I can make a start. So, in response to that, I started thinking about a reference I'm using in the text, actually, about Andrew Herscher's theorization of war architecture, how he argues that in time of crisis, the role of architecture in the urban environment shifts from just expressing the historical, cultural, and social, and so on context to becoming an active agent in the making of meanings and symbols. And this in the context of my chapter, thinking about downtown Athens, the representation of downtown Athens at the time of the financial crisis, That's how it literally played out. So there was a playground and there was an urban square that became sites of conflict. So it was the urban environment that created this particular acts in public space of conflict took place there. There was the expression of it became the place for the expression of difference and the construction of otherness. But I was also thinking about the relationship between representation and violence, or violence not just as something to be represented, but how it assumes a representational role and it creates new representations. So again, thinking about the context of Athens at the time of crisis, that was the time where the incapacity, the decline of the urban environment was very, very clear, and the incapacity of the city council to maintain, to care for the public spaces of the city created very powerful images. And then, and I'm sure you've seen kind of Athens covered with graffiti and inscriptions at that time. And this led to more inscriptions, and specifically to the racist inscription that I'm writing about in the book, that then became such it's began to act upon the immigrant population of the district. And again, kind of this taken into thinking about the digital representation, this further accentuated the image of the public space and the use of the space itself. Yeah, and I'll probably stop here too.
So in our chapter, we kind of used 4 case studies. So we talked about Dhaka, then kind of Nepal, Kathmandu, then Mumbai, India, and then Philippines. And so we discussed about these 4 cities where we kind of compared the vision and mission of different authorities, state authorities. And so in all these Asian cities, we found that there was a kind of a aspiration from the authorities that they want to build very beautiful kind of a nice cities, often very metropolitan cities, following kind of the global north aspiration. And in doing so, they often ignore the people who were kind of organizing themselves like slum dwellers and kind of building their own settlements in those cities. So we are kind of looking at slum displacement and how the kind of grand narratives actually not including everyone when they are designing the cities. So how rather they were kind of displacing these people from their settlements in order to kind of keep the cities beautiful. So that was kind of and so we use violence as a lens to kind of look at like how the state use this kind of violent mechanism to displace some citizens and then try to prioritize other citizens' rights to the city.
Francesco, do you want to jump in then?
Yes, now I wrote an introduction to this section about violence and relationship between architecture and urbanism, but specifically the relationship between violence and spectacle. And the relationship is really subtle because we need to understand what does it mean that the world is being turned into an image, or that something we perceive as solid as the built environment has become an image in itself. And what does it mean that this image is consumed and is commodified? So it's quite a complex process. And in this regard, I would like to discuss Katerina chapter that I apologize for the pronunciation. I think it is called Athens Agios Panteleimon Square. Is that correct, Katerina? Did I got it wrong the way I pronounced it? By the way, the point.
Fine, absolutely fine.
Oh, thank you
It
very
had
much.
to be a name like this.
So the urban setting is transformed into a spectacularized background where amateur video footage is used to craft, at least was used to craft a mediatized narrative that scapegoated immigrant and legitimized the far-right xenophobic violence. But this is not the point itself. The point is that urban space in this regard does not merely become the sites of a conflict, but actually medium for ideological spectacle that reinforce exclusionary and nationalist discourses. In this regard, we also need to understand that in the contemporary city, the relationship between architecture, urbanism, and violence emerges as both structural and symbolic, and in this regard is deeply intertwined with the dynamics of control, exclusion, and spectacle. And therefore, in this regard, spectacle, rather than just being a neutral aesthetic practice, becomes an instrument for economic exploitation or ideological manipulation. There is a very long history of this happening, possibly starting with Haussmann's transformation of Paris, the introduction of arcades and boulevards again in Paris, the contemporary monumental architecture, which highlights how architecture has been used to assert power, visibility, and order, very often at the expenses of marginalized groups. And in this regard, we may call into being other theories like Neil Leach, for example, who coined the term anesthetics of architecture, which is a process involving the numbing of critical awareness or the masking of social inequalities, or Giorgio Agamben's concepts of the economy of appearances, where again the spectacle in the case of the violence associated with it often operates as a form of deterrence and apparent pacification. So I would like also to end this short contribution also by quoting another chapter in this section from Pedro Arantes and Claudio Ribeiro that describe this systematic process of gentrification veiled by the glamour of spectacular urban interventions, where they prove that with the excuse of a tropical belle epoque or the excuse of urban renewal or urban welfare, effectively displaced impoverished communities in favor of the most wealthy strata of the population. In this regard, architecture and urbanism are not passive backdrops, but active agents in the production of violence, operating through both physical displacements and the construction of symbolic, mediated representation of order, security, and progress.
Sabina, I wonder if you want to come in at that point. I mean, I can't help but read bits of your abstract where you were highlighting more hope-filled potentials of architecture. So I think you're here as a kind of representative of volume 2, which is, in my reading of it, is more prospective, more propositional. So in this, or against this discussion of violence, I wondered how you might either read against it or read with it in a more hope-filled way. Is that possible?
I think it's definitely possible. So first of all, I was writing the introduction to the first section of the volume 2, which is events and dissidence. And actually, I was brought to these topics by Farzaneh and Nikolina. So thanks for bringing me to these specific lenses, which I had not before developed so much thought upon. And I guess it's rather with developing thought with violence, in the sense that I guess to see urban development and also what architects, urbanists, and planners can do, also in the sorts of ambivalences between structural violence, but also hopeful action is I guess key of my work also. And I would like to maybe expand on that in 4 short points. First, I guess a lot of violence is expressed through the pressures that we see that are rising on everyday lives in cities. Yeah, and I guess the handbooks speak a lot in these different chapters on all these issues. These are, of course, ecological pressures, social, economic, cultural, and political pressures. And we see, of course, that an immediate pressure maybe is not yet sensed as violence, but also may bring people, communities, publics to act more violently, first silently, and then more outspoken. So these pressures are, I guess, very important to acknowledge when it comes to also having a perspective on everyday life and our action as architects and planners. The second point is how violence also, and I guess Francesco was talking to that, also citing Agamben's work, how violence is materializing also in a growing neo-authoritarian or neo-fascist context, which builds upon what we have called earlier in earlier books the unsettled urban condition. So there is a lot of social inequality inscribed in urban development, and I guess we need to also to analyze how these imbalances have not been properly worked in a lot of urban development contexts, and how this is now exacerbated by these neo-fascist regimes, for example. But now I'm still on the very, let's say, critical side. So I guess coming more to the hopeful part is, I guess, that dissidence and also events, but now maybe resting a moment with dissidence, cannot just seen as a reaction to violence, but also as a strong position towards revisiting what is democratic action, what is this sort of society we want to live in, and also reaffirm these values somehow, or check if they are still present and how we can maybe develop them anew. And it is also, I guess, being a dissident in architecture, in urbanism, and in planning, we are very powerful, and we have seen that in a lot of case studies in the book and beyond the book. The Gezi Park protests and the involvement of architects in protest here and organizing the protest, but also in Spain, in the Indignados movement, is key. Yeah, so I guess these are just two examples. And so I guess our professions, we have a lot to bring to protest and to dissidence, and especially in this climate. And maybe the last point, and that's what I take from an activity that we have been organizing in Cyprus, is rather on global borders and how they, in this sort of tension, times of tensions and unsettlement, are shifted and fought over. So we have been in Cyprus and the cold conflict. And I listened to a Palestinian working in Israel, and she said, we have historical proof of how the conflict that is sort of in the region was inscribed into the width of walls via floor plans. Yeah, so this violence also materializes just in floor plan layouts, for example. And I guess that was very insightful, listening to how different communities get differently constructed buildings, for example. So I guess this also is to, I guess, reassess violent thinking that is maybe not explicit but implicit in our own disciplines. And those readers, I guess, are a key source to start doing that more systematically. So I thank Farzaneh and Nikolina for that. And maybe a last note on the hopeful potential. I guess what we also see is beyond new systemic forms of violence, and also to have a Gramscian take on that, and to see how hegemony is reconstructing more violently in these times. We also see a strong search, both on very local levels, but also more globally, to resist these tendencies. And I guess our disciplines have a key role to play in there.
Maybe at this point, we could also ask Nikolina and Farzaneh to contribute their ideas, because they're not only here as editors, but also contributors, obviously, to the discourse.
No, perhaps I go first because I had this chapter in this volume. But before that, I just want to make a correction. At the start of my section, I mentioned that me and Nikolina completed our PhD at a different organization, institution. So we both completed our PhD at the University of Sydney. So apologies for the mistake. My chapter in the first volume was investigating the violence in the urban street in Iran. So just what Francesco mentioned that resonated with me. You're talking about the very subtle relationship between violence, media, and an urban space. I found that this is a very rich area for architectural theory, or for, as an educator, for even the design studio, to explore this nexus between the three of them. And what prompted me to think more carefully was I was looking at an essay by Judith Butler, and one sentence of it stood out for me. she's talking about how the frames of war are constructed and how those frames would constitute who is human and who is not. Or the idea of super border by Bolivar, who argues that the super borders construct life zone and death zones. So my interest started with looking at the architecture, looking at the urban space, looking at the elements that construct who has the right to live and who doesn't, and what is the role of architecture here or urban space. And when these images of it will be produced, reproduced, they become this commodity for the consumption and create this numbing effect of the lives being lost. So in that intersection, I realized there is this possibility for linking architecture to human rights. So one of the ideas that Nikolina and I were talking about in the introduction of the handbook, that is the lack of exploration that look at the architecture and the urban space relevance to human rights as well. Yeah, so I think that was from my take, from my perspective, that was kind of an exploration of this nexus through my chapter.
Okay, thank you so much. I didn't necessarily contribute with my own chapter to volume 1. My chapter featured in volume 2, but I think something that I think I could pick up on is that both Farzaneh and I wrote the introduction to volume 1, and this relationship between media and violence, specifically in terms of the role of kind of warfare and the way in which distancing starts to kind of foster an opportunity to twist the narration of what actually takes place in various contexts, whether it may be targeting of a specific region, such as we also wrote about for example, the NATO bombings of Serbia, Belgrade in 1999, and we also referred to the Gulf War through the thinking of Baudrillard and Paul Virilio. So, and the way in which they talk, the way in which kind of wars are waged through electronic kind of countermeasures. So it becomes very hard to see what actually took place or what actually takes place in the context of where kind of wars are waged against.
I'm mindful that the other question that you sent round, exploring links between media and spectacle, in some ways, I think that's been written through everyone's response so far. So, and we haven't really come to that question, but I think some of the complexities of these mediated versions of violence, but also the invisibility or the misdirection that some spectacle can introduce into these situations is also important and interesting. I think particularly some of the work that Let funded and her chapter, things like planning documentation, where there's a kind of invisibility to the exercise of power that is often in contrast or is hidden away because of more spectacular events taking place elsewhere. I should shut up, shouldn't I? And perhaps Dagmar, have you got anything to add? I think we should be pulling these threads to a close.
I think just as a reflection, I think it's super interesting how the aspect or the word of violence traveling through so many different minds has so many very different connotations, from direct and physical violence towards regulatory violence, towards even a violence that can happen through architectural practice and in architectural academia by not giving full overviews or not by giving agency. So subtle forms and invisible forms of violence that we're dealing with. can be brought through your contributions, can be brought very much forward, including that, because the idea of the spectacle is somewhat sensational, at least to me. So the idea of the event and the spectacle is part of an architectural rhetoric. But then if you really run it through, what is the act, what is the event, what is acted upon, and who is acting, and on which prompts and on which commands, it becomes very pressing. And again, it becomes very sensitive and very political for all of us.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much. And I guess some of the heavier themes which were discussed today, over the next 2 or 3 days, we will unpack them and hopefully find more modes and more models of resistance, given that the next 2 to 3 days will particularly be focusing on the agenda of volume 2 a little bit more.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank
see
you
you.
all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay.
Thanks.
See you.